The first 2 years of Abraham Lincoln's presidency had been nightmares. In the West, a few generals like Ulysses Grant had won several notable victories over the Confederacy and had pushed the Confederates out of Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, almost all of Tennessee, into northern Mississippi, and even seized the tip of the Mississippi River itself at New Orleans. But the great central stretch of the Mississippi River was still in rebel hands, and as long as it was, the farmers and businessmen of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and the upper Northwest were cut off from the great river highway they had built their fortunes on. And as the congressional by-elections loomed in the fall of 1862, bankrupt farmers and businessmen were apt to take their frustrations with them to the polls. The Emancipation Proclamation, which he issued on September 22nd, 1862, only promised to make this situation worse. White Northerners might be willing to fight to save the Union, but not to emancipate black slaves, and they carried their disapproval straight to the ballot box. The result was that in the fall 1862 elections, Lincoln and his party were badly bruised at both the state and the national level. In Lincoln's own home state of Illinois, Republicans lost control of both houses of the legislature. And when the new Democratic legislature assembled in January of 1863, its members were right on their feet with hysterical resolutions denouncing emancipation and calling for a negotiated peace. Whereas, they said, the government of the United States has been engaged for nearly 2 years in an unsuccessful attempt to suppress the Southern Rebellion, and whereas our country is becoming a nation of widows and orphans, who, if the President's Emancipation Proclamation be carried into effect, will become prey to the lusts of freed Negroes who will overrun our country, we are in favor of an immediate suspension of hostilities and recommend the holding of a national convention for an amicable settlement of our difficulties. In Congress, Lincoln's Republicans held on to a slim majority in the House and the Senate, but the losses were depressing all the same, and loud mutterings were heard even from moderate Republican leaders about Lincoln's responsibility for those losses. It didn't help that in the East, Lincoln's generals had led the Army of the Potomac from one dreary defeat to another. Once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it was clear to Lincoln that the unresponsive and unsympathetic General George McClellan would have to go as the Army's commander, and so he did in November 1862. But his replacement, Ambrose Burnside, only led the Army of the Potomac to a gigantic and bloody defeat at Fredericksburg, Virginia, in December. And his successor, Joseph Hooker, led them to another defeat, just as embarrassing, at Chancellorsville in May 1863. Each defeat plunged Lincoln deeper into gloom. After the Fredericksburg defeat, Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin remembered that Lincoln moaned and groaned in anguish. He walked the floor, wringing his hands and uttering exclamations of grief, saying over and over again, "Why has God put me in this place?" Lincoln had more than just the losses on the battlefield to mourn. He had come to the White House in 1861 as one of the youngest presidents in recent memory, and with more energy and stamina than most Washington old-timers, and with 2 young children and a wife eager to make a splash in Washington society. But Mary Lincoln soon found that despite her Kentucky bluegrass upbringing, Washington was still very much a Southern town. And socially speaking, she was treated by the grandes dames of Washington as a déclassé Westerner. And the harder that Mary tried to play grande dame herself and throw great dinner parties and dress according to fashion, the more she was mocked and ostracized. Even Lincoln was irked by the money that she lavished on low-cut fashion. And he was deeply embarrassed when he discovered in December 1861 that she had hugely overspent the congressional appropriation for redecorating the White House. It would stink, he said. It would stink in the land to have it said that an appropriation of $20,000 for furnishing the house had been overrun by the president when the poor, freezing soldiers could not have blankets. Lincoln said that he would never approve the bills for flub-dubs for that damned old house. But loss of face like this was nothing beside the loss of life in Lincoln's own family that Lincoln had to sustain in February 1862, when his second oldest son, 11-year-old William Wallace Lincoln, fell ill with typhoid fever from the tainted Washington water system. Willie Lincoln was the child closest to Lincoln's heart, the true picture of Mr. Lincoln in every way, according to one Springfield, Illinois neighbor, even to carrying his head slightly inclined toward his left shoulder. But after a lengthy sickness, the typhoid killed the boy on February 20th, 1862. Lincoln was devastated. He wept uncontrollably. He dreamt that Willie came at night to his bedside, and he was still talking about the loss of our darling Willie on the last day of his own life. It might have helped if Lincoln could have felt that at least within his own party, he had a core of loyal supporters that he could fall back upon. But even there, Lincoln all too often found himself alone. No president ever had a cabinet of which the members were so independent, had so large individual followings, and were so inharmonious, wrote the New York politician Chauncey Depew. Lincoln had known from the beginning that it would take every ounce of his energy to corral Secretary of State William Henry Seward. And he knew that Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase would use every spare moment to plan his own dump Lincoln movement for the presidency in 1864. But this was aggravated by the restlessness and impatience of the radical Republican members of Congress, Thaddeus Stevens, Zachariah Chandler, Benjamin Wade, Henry Winter Davis, who made no secret of their opinion that Lincoln was a fumbling incompetent. Even Republican moderates, like Maine Senator William Pitt Fessenden, remarked contemptuously, "Our poor president is having a hard time of it. The good fellow thinks it is his duty to see to everything and to do everything himself, and consequently does many things foolishly." The greatest mistake, however, that anyone ever made on the legal circuit about Abraham Lincoln was to underestimate him. And that was just as true in the presidency. For Lincoln had a depth of internal resources to fall back upon, which would not only buoy him through the troubled first 2 years of the war, but which would allow him to triumph over all the worldly wise men who clucked over his supposed inadequacies. The first of these resources was his ancestral conviction in the certainty and predestined end of all events, including the war. It was that conviction that God had ordained a goal in the war which would be realized no matter what obstacles men placed before it, which nerved him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It was that same conviction which strengthened him to carry it on along past all the opposition and criticism of emancipation. One evening, his old law partner and one-time mentor, John Todd Stewart, remarked to Lincoln, "I have suffered a great deal about this war, of course. My friends and relatives are all in the southern states. I don't think you or any other man can make it go on just as you wish. I believe that Providence is carrying on this thing." And Lincoln replied, said Stewart, with great emphasis, "Stewart, that is just my opinion." And if Providence was indeed carrying the war forward, Lincoln's task was not to worry about whether it would turn out right, but to carefully observe and calculate all the little ways in which God was arranging the events of the war and interpret them to the people and the politicians. He believed from the first, I think, that the agitation of slavery would produce its overthrow, recalled Leonard Swett. And he noticed that Lincoln carried with him a kind of account book of how things were progressing for 3 or 4 months. And whenever I would get nervous and think things were going wrong, he would get out his estimates and show how everything on the great scale of action, the resolutions of legislatures, the instructions of delegates, and things of that character, was going exactly as he expected. Lincoln had, in other words, the coup of the eye, an extraordinary capacity based on the certainty with which he believed God moved events to see and anticipate the unfolding of events 18 to 24 months ahead. And it was one of the great weapons in his arsenal of leadership skills. Lincoln also possessed far shrewder powers of analyzing others' character strengths and weaknesses than his critics guessed. The radicals in Congress learned this lesson for the first time in December 1862. The ever-ambitious Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase, had spent months whispering to the Senate Republican caucus that Secretary of State Seward was unreliable on the emancipation issue, and had actually restrained Lincoln from issuing the proclamation and issued decisions without bothering to consult the rest of the cabinet. The point of this intrigue was to get Seward removed as Secretary of State. The Senate Republican caucus, sensibly and appropriately alarmed, would march into Lincoln's office, and there they expected they would get Seward sacked. And that suited Salmon Chase just fine, because it would leave Chase as the single most powerful individual in the cabinet, as well as recruiting Senate Republicans to his personal political coterie. Lincoln was brought word of this plan on December 17th. Seward at once offered to spare Lincoln and resign immediately. But Lincoln was not ready to see his cabinet turned into a cat's paw of the Senate caucus. Instead, Lincoln invited the caucus to meet with him on the 18th of December to hear their grievances. And then, once he had the story figured out clearly, he called both the cabinet and the caucus to meet together on December 19th without informing either that the other would be coming. Suddenly, Salmon Chase found himself in front of both his fellow cabinet members as well as the caucus he had tattled to. And Lincoln pressed the point home by asking the other cabinet members in the hearing of the caucus whether they had ever found Seward guilty of the crimes alleged. None did. All eyes turned on Chase, who stammered out that he had not exactly meant to allege that Seward was guilty of, and so it went. Chase was exposed as a gossip, and the angered senators took their hats and went out into the night. The next day, Chase offered Lincoln his resignation. But placing Seward's resignation and Chase's resignation side by side, Lincoln announced that he would accept neither, and both would go back to their jobs without troubling him further. It is a measure of just how much the radicals underestimated Lincoln that they failed to learn from this encounter the lesson that they needed about not challenging Lincoln. No single issue after emancipation irked the radicals of Lincoln's party more than the plans Lincoln laid down for reorganizing and reconstructing the southern states as one by one the federal armies would reconquer them. Lincoln insisted that the reconstruction of the Confederate States was a presidential prerogative. They replied that Congress should draw up such plans. Lincoln wanted Reconstruction to lead quickly to readmission of the defeated rebel states to the Union. The extreme fringe of the radicals wanted the defeated Confederate states stripped of statehood and reduced to the status of federal territories. Above all, Lincoln wanted to allow a rebel state to return to the United States if it would draw up a new constitution banning slavery and administer an oath of allegiance to at least 10% of its voters from the 1860 census. The radicals, headed by Benjamin Wade and Henry Winter Davis, wanted the allegiance percentage up to 50% of the voters, a percentage which Wade and Davis knew was probably impossible. The radicals, in short, wanted the leverage to work a social experiment on Southern society once the war was over. Lincoln wanted a reunited country as soon as he could get it, and without further bloodshed, and a reconstruction that threatened Southerners with federal annihilation would only encourage the rebels to fight longer and harder. But rather than square off for a confrontation with the radicals over Reconstruction, Lincoln merely ignored them. If Reconstruction was, as he insisted, a presidential prerogative, then he was under no obligation to consult the radicals, much less fight publicly with them on the floor of the Capitol. When, in the summer of 1863, Benjamin Wade went personally to Lincoln in the White House to tell him, "You are letting the country go to hell. We are not more than a mile from there now," Lincoln wryly dismissed him. "Mr. Wade, that is just about the distance to the Capitol, isn't it?" Finally, in the summer of 1864, Wade and Davis formulated their own Reconstruction bill and negotiated it through Congress. They delivered it to Lincoln. However, they did it on July 4th, the last day of the congressional session, and Lincoln merely, quietly, pocket vetoed it. The third great asset which allowed Lincoln gradually to turn his administration from embarrassment to triumph lay in his own magical ability with words. The 19th century was the literary era of the three-decker novel, of purple, deep purple political prose, of exaggerated and overwrought gestures, of the high rhetoric which was supposed to be appropriate to statesmen and orators. Lincoln had none of this. His own writing and speaking style had been hammered out on the hard anvil of county courthouses, where clarity, precision, and brevity were key to convincing juries. And he took that style into his public documents as president. Lincoln made comparatively few speeches as president. It was the custom that his annual state messages to Congress, the major speech events of his administration, were actually sent over to the Capitol at the opening of each December session of Congress and read aloud by a clerk. His most important live speeches were his two great inaugural addresses, where he established levels of persuasion and eloquence unmatched by any American president since. And the occasional speech he would arrange to deliver at a particularly significant public event, such as the Gettysburg Address, would also have that peculiar eloquence. But the greatest speech category that Lincoln mastered was not, strictly speaking, a speech at all, but the public letter. In an age which knew nothing of news conferences, there were, in fact, only about a dozen national newspaper correspondents operating in Washington during the war, and the Associated Press was in its infancy. It was customary for public officials, and especially presidents and presidential candidates, to put their ideas on public policy into the form of a letter. This letter might ostensibly be addressed to an individual, but it was published in a politically friendly newspaper and then copied to other newspapers around the country. Lincoln resorted to all three of these forms of communication as a way of being the best defender of his own ideas. And his success was extraordinary. His first message to Congress, actually delivered to the special session that he called in July 1861, gave no ground at all to Southerners' arguments that their secession was some noble defense of states' rights or a protest against some unconstitutional threat to their slave property. Instead, Lincoln insisted, secession was an attempt to subvert the very idea of democracy. In a democracy, majorities rule, and therefore minorities must submit. When minorities rise up against that rule and refuse to abide by the decision of a majority, then the very operations of democracy are disrupted, and the only result can be anarchy. The Southern Confederacy, by refusing to abide by the results of the 1860 presidential election, had done just that. They had overthrown democracy by doing what democracy cannot survive, which was attempting to use the threat of the bullet in place of the ballot as the determiner of policy. Our popular government, Lincoln said, has often been called an experiment. 2 points in it our people have already settled: the successful establishing and successful administering of it. One still remains. It is now for them to demonstrate to the world that those who can fairly carry an election can also suppress a rebellion, that ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets, and that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no successful appeal back to bullets. Such will be a great lesson of peace, teaching men that what they cannot take by an election, neither can they take by a war. That meant that the war was not merely a squabble about who had jurisdiction over what, the federal government or the states. And the war could not be detached, even at that early date in 1861, from the overarching question of freedom. This is, he said, essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. This is the leading object of the government for whose existence we contend. Lincoln's state messages, however, were dwarfed in memory by the speeches he delivered personally on a few significant occasions, and especially the Gettysburg Address. After the terrible Union defeat at Chancellorsville in May 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia swung up into Pennsylvania in yet another invasion of the North. Lincoln turned to one more general, a Philadelphian named George G. Meade. Meade and the Army of the Potomac stopped Lee's rebels in a massive 3-day battle here at Gettysburg and forced Lee to retreat back to Virginia. Lincoln had wanted Meade to destroy Lee's army entirely, and he was bitterly disappointed when Meade allowed Lee's battered troops to escape south across the Potomac. But it was still a victory. And when the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania proposed to create a soldiers' cemetery at Gettysburg that fall, Lincoln agreed to come and make the dedicatory comments at the dedication ceremonies. Curiously, Lincoln was not the featured speaker at Gettysburg. That role fell to the venerable one-time governor of Massachusetts and president of Harvard, Edward Everett. Lincoln was allotted only a few minutes to follow Everett's 2.5-hour oration on the history of the war with a few appropriate remarks. What Lincoln had painstakingly prepared for the occasion, however, was more than appropriate. And there was a time not long ago when it was drilled into the memory of every American schoolchild. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It was significant that Lincoln dated the birth of the Republic from 87 years, from the Declaration of Independence, because for him, the Declaration of Independence furnished the proposition that was being tested in the war, whether the nation had indeed been founded on something that would endure, whether a proposition about all men being equal was a sufficient platform on which to build a government. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. However, there was a larger dedication emerging out of the sacrifices of the soldiers, a dedication of the living to that same proposition for which the soldiers had died. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In little less than 300 words, Lincoln had not only established the priorities of the war, but situated every one of his hearers in the cause of furthering those priorities, so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. At the end, poor Edward Everett could only remark, "I should be glad if I came as near the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." The last great literary genre Lincoln turned to was the public letter. Lincoln's most famous public letters were written to Horace Greeley on emancipation in August of 1862, to Erastus Corning and the Democrats of New York on civil liberties in June of 1863. But greatest of all was the letter he wrote for the statewide Republican rally in Springfield, Illinois in August of 1863. These were enormously persuasive pieces of political propaganda. Lincoln, especially in the Springfield letter, was tackling what was for Illinois in 1863 the thorniest issue of the war: why it should be fought to emancipate black slaves. Read aloud at the rally and released simultaneously to the Associated Press, Lincoln's Springfield letter came home like nothing so much as a lawyer's searching cross-examination. "There are those who are dissatisfied with me," Lincoln began simply. "And their dissatisfaction came down to one thing. You desire peace, and you blame me that we do not have it." But Lincoln was quite aware that this was not the real grounds for their dissatisfaction. "But to be plain, you are dissatisfied with me about the Negro." Lincoln's gambit at that point was to seize the moral high ground. "I certainly wish that all men could be free," an assertion which no one could easily object to. And knowing that, Lincoln turned the knife deftly on his critics by adding, "While I suppose that you do not. You say you will not fight to free Negroes. But," he added, "there were large numbers of emancipated blacks who seem to be quite willing to fight for you. Every one of them who is willing to subtract himself or herself from the Confederate war-making effort by running away to the Union lines. Every one of those emancipated slaves who is willing to don a Union uniform and carry a rifle against the rebels is just so much more aid in saving the Union. I thought," Lincoln said, "that in your struggle for the Union, to whatever extent the Negroes should cease helping the enemy, to that extent it weakened the enemy in his resistance to you." What grounds, then, did they have for opposing emancipation? Because that helped the cause they claimed they were supporting. Peace does not appear so distant as it did, Lincoln concluded. And when it came, Lincoln prophesied that there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this great consummation. While I fear, Lincoln continued, there will be some white ones, unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. The next day, no one less than the New York Times applauded vigorously. President Lincoln's letter to the Springfield Convention has all his characteristic solidity of sense and aptness of expression. It hits, as his written efforts always do, the very heart of the subject. By the end of 1863, by the midpoint of the war, Lincoln had transformed himself from an insecure and uncertain manager into a confident and competent chief executive. The old man sits here and wields like a backwoods Jupiter the bolts of war and the machinery of government with a hand equally steady and equally firm, marveled Lincoln's young secretary, John Hay. There is no man in the country so wise, so gentle, and so firm. I believe the hand of God placed him where he is. But if Lincoln had now become a great war leader, he could not afford to be the only one. Nothing that he accomplished in Congress or with words would amount to anything if it could not be matched by the armies in the field. And for that, Lincoln would need the services of a general who had grown to the same heights and from the same depths as himself. We'll find out who that is after our break. The weekend of July 4th, 1863, was the happiest Lincoln enjoyed during the Civil War. Not only was General George Meade and the Army of the Potomac victorious at Gettysburg, but news came hard on the heels of Gettysburg that far away on the Mississippi River, General Ulysses S. Grant had forced the surrender of the Confederate citadel on the Mississippi, Vicksburg. The length of the great river was now finally back in federal hands. Lincoln had never met Grant, but he had heard much about him, both good and bad. A year and a half before, Grant had caught the attention of the whole country when he seized the two key Confederate forts in Tennessee, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Then came the near disaster at Shiloh in April, where Grant was caught napping by a rebel army, sitting down to breakfast miles downriver from his encampment. Now another description of Grant emerged. He had been, people discovered, cashiered from the old regular army for alcoholism. And now stories began to spread that Grant had been drunk on the morning of Shiloh and was repeatedly drunk on other occasions. In a limbo between fame and disgrace, Grant was given what amounted to occupation duties in northern Mississippi for several months, until he finally gained approval for the operation that would move overland against Vicksburg, that last great Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, and thereby redeem himself. Lincoln watched Grant's activities with a mixture of apprehension and interest. He appreciated Grant's fighting qualities and Grant's superb organizational abilities, but Lincoln was shy of alcoholics. He didn't drink himself at all. And he was unsure whether he could trust Grant sufficiently to lift him to higher commands. The proposed operation on Vicksburg was a case in point. Lincoln believed that Vicksburg was probably too strong to be taken, and that the best plan was for Grant to bypass the city, secure the remainder of the Mississippi down to New Orleans, and be content with that. And at first, Lincoln's apprehensions seemed justified. Between December 1862 and May 1863, Grant launched 12 separate operations around Vicksburg, all of which sagged into swampy failure. But in May, Grant succeeded in landing troops just below the city, turning and cooping its defenders into a siege, and finally compelling their wholesale surrender on the 4th of July. Was Grant the general Lincoln needed to win the war? Should he bring him east and give him the command that George McClellan had fumbled away? Lincoln might have been inclined to do so as early as the summer of 1863, but mistrust over Grant lingered in the air. Was he really that vulnerable to drink? And how well would a Westerner fare at the helm of the Eastern Army? The Army of the Potomac had been built by George McClellan. It was a spit and polish affair. And Grant was renowned for a more rough and ready, no-nonsense image. The Army of the Potomac was also an army which still reflected McClellan's political opinions about how the war should be waged. And Grant might easily find himself a victor on the field of battle, but a big loser to the internal feuding of the Army of the Potomac. Besides, when Grant was sounded out informally by a War Department representative about his interest in coming east to take command, even Grant balked. And so matters rested. But not for long. In September, a federal army under William S. Rosecrans successfully captured the key Confederate railroad center of Chattanooga, opening the path to Atlanta and the southern heartland. But when Rosecrans began his advance south from Chattanooga, he walked into a Confederate trap at Chickamauga. And he was handed one of the worst Union defeats of the war. The remainder of Rosecrans' army was penned back up into Chattanooga by the rebels, and for a while that fall, it looked as though the rebels might be able to pull a Vicksburg in reverse. But again, it was Grant who saved the day. Grant forced open a supply line to Chattanooga along the Tennessee River, and then in November drove the besieging Confederates away from Chattanooga in a great battle along Missionary Ridge. Vicksburg and Chattanooga, together in 1 year, now made the call for Grant to come east irresistible. In December, Congress revived the Army rank of Lieutenant General, which had previously only been held by George Washington. And in the spring of 1864, Grant came to Washington to receive his commission and to have the heavy hand of the President laid on him to take up command in the East. Grant finally agreed. If he had known what was going to happen next, he might not have. The spring of 1864 looked like it meant the end of the war at last. The Mississippi was open, the path to Atlanta was ready, and Grant had left his principal lieutenant, William T. Sherman, in charge of a federal army that would descend on Atlanta as soon as the spring permitted. And Grant was ready to take the Army of the Potomac deep into Virginia to finish the work that McClellan ought to have completed 2 years before. It went without saying that this was coming not a moment too soon for Lincoln. Dissatisfaction with the Emancipation Proclamation still bubbled in the public mind. The War Department was imposing a military draft for the first time in American history to keep the supply of soldiers coming into uniform. And public opposition to the draft was even angrier than to emancipation. And above all, a presidential election was looming in the fall of 1864. Lincoln must have victory, and victory now, or else he had to worry that the people's patience might finally run out on him at the polls. It is remarkable in this respect that Lincoln never seems once to have considered declaring a national emergency and suspending the national elections of 1864. All through the war, the Northern Democratic opposition screamed without pause over civil liberties violations by Lincoln's administration and the Union military. Military arrests of civilians without access to counsel, harassing or shutting down newspapers, suspending the writ of habeas corpus so that suspects could be held indefinitely without trial. And they pilloried Lincoln as a would-be dictator, plotting to make himself king or tyrant or despot, treading on the Constitution and sacrificing American liberty to his own vanity, or, in uglier, racist terms, to worship of the Negro. But looked at in comparison with the record of our own times during war, the Red Scare after World War I, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, campus violence during the Vietnam years, Lincoln's record on civil liberties almost looks dangerously indulgent. The total number of verifiable civilian arrests by the administration or the military during the war amounts to no more than 14,000. And the overwhelming percentage of those were in the uncertain border states where Confederate sympathizers and activists were known to be thick on the ground. If anything, Lincoln showed himself to be almost overcautious in his treatment of constitutional issues. The Emancipation Proclamation, remember, had been carefully framed as a military action under the president's war powers. He was meticulous in seeking out legal opinions from his Attorney General, Edward Bates, to support actions as Commander-in-Chief as minor as the appointment of a temperance representative as an officer, or the remission of a fine imposed on a restaurant owner for selling brandy to a wounded soldier. The adoption of policies, Lincoln said, on the sole ground that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right, bothered Lincoln. Would I not thus give up all footing upon Constitution or law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism? Would it not lose us the very cause we seek to advance? And Lincoln remained so bothered by the constitutionality of the Emancipation Proclamation that in 1864 he began pressuring Congress to write a new 13th Amendment to the Constitution, banning slavery for good and for all, rather than merely relying on the proclamation. But if ever there was a time when Lincoln would be tempted to rethink this cautious constitutionalism, it would be the summer of 1864. At the beginning of May, Grant and the Army of the Potomac jumped off toward Richmond, while at the same time Sherman marched out of Chattanooga for Atlanta. 3 months later, neither of them was close to taking either. Grant smashed into Lee's rebels at the Battle of the Wilderness at the beginning of May, and he was stunned by the ferocity of Lee's resistance. Unlike his predecessors, Grant refused to back off. He sent word to Lincoln instead that he intended to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. That defiant note pleased Lincoln, until it began to seem as though that was all that was going to happen. Grant maneuvered around Lee and smashed into him again at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and then again at the North Anna River, and again at Cold Harbor, until finally, by the end of June, Grant had settled into a siege around Richmond that looked like it might have no end. In Georgia, a canny Confederate general named Joseph Johnston played cat and mouse with William T. Sherman, tic-tacking across the geography of northern Georgia like a chessboard and keeping Atlanta just out of Sherman's reach. The casualty lists mounted, and the objectives were not taken, and public opinion sagged dangerously. And the election was getting closer. Lincoln had no trouble getting the renomination of his own party convention. By that point, he was well in control of the party apparatus. But all the signs were pointing to a rejuvenated Democratic Party nominating George McClellan for president, on a platform that called for an immediate armistice and no more talk about emancipation and the abolition of slavery. I believe, wrote McClellan, that a vast majority of our people, whether in the Army and Navy or at home, would with me hail with unbounded joy the permanent restoration of peace on the basis of the federal union of the states, without the effusion of another drop of blood. Not a word to be said about slavery. By the end of August 1864, the climate looked very bad indeed for Lincoln. John Hay found Democrats exultant, and our own people either growling and despondent or sneakingly apologetic. Years later, Pennsylvania politician Alexander McClure was certain that there was no period from January 1864 until the 3rd of September of the same year when McClellan would not have defeated Lincoln. But then the wind abruptly changed. Confederate President Jefferson Davis removed Joe Johnston from command of the rebel army opposing Sherman and replaced him
with the reckless John Bell Hood. Hood threw his army directly at Sherman, who cheerfully defeated him and forced Hood to abandon Atlanta to Sherman. At sea, the notorious Confederate commerce raider Alabama was caught and sunk off the coast of France, and Union Admiral David Farragut and a Union squadron shot their way past the forts guarding Mobile Bay for a spectacular victory. Northern spirits buoyed up again. And on November 8th, Election Day, Lincoln won a crushing 55% of the popular vote, while Republicans regained secure majorities in both houses of Congress. Long Abe Lincoln, cracked Harper's Weekly, has just grown a little longer. And the Confederacy had just grown a little shorter. By the fall of 1864, large portions of the Confederacy's territory were under Union occupation. And while there were still two dangerous Confederate armies on the loose in Virginia and Georgia, the means for supporting, arming, and feeding those armies were shrinking. Over the winter of 1864 to 65, the once undefeated Confederate armies began to hemorrhage deserters. Demands for individual Southern states to open up peace talks with the North were heard. In February, Jefferson Davis even dispatched 3 emissaries to meet secretly with Lincoln to negotiate a peace. And then finally came the unthinkable. Robert E. Lee endorsed the recruiting and arming of black slaves to fight for the Confederacy on the promise of freedom for their service. The question in the minds of everyone as the frosts of winter yielded to the early spring of 1865 was not whether, but when the Confederacy would buckle, and what kind of peace should then take place. Those questions were foremost in Lincoln's mind, too. He had all along insisted that he had no single plan for reconstructing the defeated South. He preferred to let the defeated states sort out their own wreckage and rejoin the Union as quickly as possible. But he had now begun to attach qualifications to that. The defeated Confederate states must embrace the Emancipation Proclamation. They must ratify the new 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. They must make realistic provisions for the freed slaves, beginning with apprenticeships that would be the first step out of the degradation of slavery, but looking forward to full civil rights for black Army veterans and for the educated class. And as for the Confederate leadership, Lincoln preferred that they quietly disappear, perhaps to Mexico or Brazil. He did not want them back in power, but he didn't want the ugly prospect of treason trials. Above all, he wanted a free hand for keeping the radicals of his own party at bay. It was with all this in mind that Lincoln stepped to the podium on the east portico of the Capitol on March 4th, 1865, to take his second oath of office as president and deliver his second inaugural. The second inaugural was far shorter than his first because it made no effort at outlining a specific policy. Instead, Lincoln was looking to outline what we might call a philosophy, almost a theology of the war. And the principles coming out of that would guide the peace. What has caused the war? He asked. The answer, coming now after 4 years of war, was clear beyond all the political smokescreens of 1861. All knew that slavery was somehow the cause of the war, Lincoln said. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Yet, in Lincoln's view, slavery was only the immediate cause of the war. Behind it, Lincoln discerned a larger, more ultimate cause for the war, the cause of divine justice. For the truth was that slavery was a crime that all Americans had been guilty of in various ways all through their history. It was not merely a matter of one section being guilty and the other innocent. The Almighty has His own purposes, Lincoln said. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses, which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through His appointed time, He now wills to remove, and that He gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to Him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The Civil War was not merely about the North punishing the South for secession, but about God holding an entire nation to account for its complicity in slavery. And if Northerners were bold-faced enough to protest that this was unfair, that they were not the slaveholders, and they had not started the war, and that God and Lincoln had made a great mistake by including them in the indictment, Lincoln would only remind them that it was they who had made the great mistake by failing to understand the justice of God. As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Knowing that was what led Lincoln at the end to sketch out in words that sounded like a benediction his own notion of a just Reconstruction, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This was not at all what the radicals of his own party had in mind for the defeated South, but with an electoral mandate behind him, Lincoln was in charge, and they would have to play by his rules. 3 weeks later, the spring thaws set in below Richmond. Grant began probing the Confederate defenses and found them weakened and papery from desertions. Before Grant could launch a blow, Lee gathered what was left of his troops, abandoned Richmond, and fled west. But Grant caught the famished Confederates at Appomattox Courthouse, and on April 9th, Lee surrendered all that was left of his pitiful army, less than 30,000 men. To the south, Sherman had cornered the other Confederate army and was about to force its surrender Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government were on the run somewhere in North Carolina. The war was coming, finally, to an end. April 9th was Palm Sunday. And the following Friday, April 14th, was Good Friday. Lincoln chose to go, not to church, but that evening to Ford's Theater, to relax with an English comedy of manners named Our American Cousin, and to acknowledge the adulation of the packed house. Shortly after 10 o'clock, a well-known Maryland-born actor and sometime Confederate agent named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box, placed a derringer behind Lincoln's head, and shot him. Although doctors were rushed within minutes to his side, Lincoln was probably already brain dead within 10 minutes of the shooting. They kept him breathing, however, and carried him across the street to a boarding house where he could be stretched out on a bed. But this was really only a gesture of devotion. The next morning, at 7:22 a.m., even Lincoln's breathing ceased, and the 16th president was dead. How do we estimate the achievement of Abraham Lincoln? 5 days after Lincoln's body was laid to rest in a temporary tomb in his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, John Locke Scripps, who had badgered Lincoln into writing his first campaign autobiography so long ago, wrote to William Henry Herndon, Lincoln's own law partner, to begin asking that very question. In certain showy and what is said to be most desirable endowments, how many Americans have surpassed him? Scripps wrote. Yet how he looms above them now. He had become, said Scripps, the great American man, the grand central figure in American, perhaps the world's history. But if he was the great American man, there were particular ways in which Lincoln fulfilled that description and in which he redefined American greatness. The first of these was the way in which he gave a lifelong demonstration of the mobility of American life. As the first major Western society with no aristocracy, in fact, with an upper class that only faintly resembled those of Europe, the United States offered no formal obstacles to anyone transforming themselves into something newer, better, or greater, if they had the will and the talent. Lincoln had risen from rural poverty to professional success and then to political triumph in a single lifetime, and he was very aware of what his example meant. There is no permanent class of hired laborers amongst us, Lincoln said in 1859. 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer. The hired laborer of yesterday labors on his own account today and will hire others to labor for him tomorrow. Advancement, improvement of condition is the order of things in a society of equals. 5 years later, he told the soldiers of the 148th Ohio Regiment, nowhere in the world is presented a government of so much liberty and equality. To the humblest and poorest amongst us are held out the highest privileges and positions. The present moment finds me at the White House. Yet there is as good a chance for your children as there was for my fathers. If ever there was a believer in the American dream, it was Abraham Lincoln. The second of these ways in which Lincoln redefines American greatness was his devotion to the Declaration of Independence's statement about equality, which Lincoln took as a fundamental truth of human nature that anyone, no matter what their race or nation, could understand and embrace. The United States was brought forth in liberty, he said at Gettysburg, and dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. Unlike all the other nations of the world, the United States had no condition of citizenship based on blood or kinship or race or language. Citizenship in the United States, the very identity of the United States, was cemented instead to that proposition, to a logical statement about human nature that was true in all places and in all times. Perhaps half our people, Lincoln said in 1858, are men who have come from Europe, German, Irish, French, and Scandinavian. If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men that wrote that declaration, and so they are. That is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. The third way in which Lincoln defined American greatness was his recognition of how closely bonded political and moral considerations had to be in such a nation. A nation founded on a proposition and lacking the restraint of unspoken traditions or ancestral custom can sometimes do the wrong thing with that proposition. It can, in the case of the slaveholding South, insist that the equality in that proposition is only an equality of white people. Or it can say, in the case of Stephen A. Douglas, that everyone is entitled to pursue equality in their own way, free from anyone else's objection. Lincoln saw that as much as politics and religion and morality don't always make for a good marriage, they make for an even worse divorce. For this consistently secular man who never joined a church, there was still no way to speak in America of equality and politics in ways which did not conform to the eternal principles of right and wrong. Nor did he hesitate to chart out a path for a political future he did not live to realize by reminding people that the future had to be seen under the dictates of the justice of God. 149 years after Lincoln's death, his image has begun to fade for many Americans. His birthday, which became a national holiday in 1909, has been collapsed into a generic President's Day. He has been attacked by the descendants of the people he freed as an untrustworthy half-heart. He has been made a character of slapstick comedy. And yet his ideas may be more relevant for us today than at any time since. To the voices which deny that opportunity means anything anymore in America, to the voices which argue that we have become a mega society of faceless corporations and permanent interests, those of us who have known the opportunity to rise, those of us who have known the opportunity to transform ourselves, must speak back the words of Lincoln. To the voices which preach the politics of race and blood and hate, To those who preach a failure of culture so great that in America no one thing can any longer be true for everyone. Those of us who have known the power of that great central proposition in the Gettysburg Address must speak back the words of Lincoln. And to those who insist selfishly that no right exists in public or in private except the right to do as I please, we who have loved the memory of this quaint, peculiar man, this prairie lawyer, we must speak back the words of Lincoln. That when anyone who invites any people willing to have slavery to establish it, he is blowing out the moral lights around us. When he says he cares not whether slavery is voted down or voted up, that it is a sacred right of self-government, he is, in my judgment, penetrating the human soul and eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty in this American people. For Lincoln, moral principle, in the end, is all that unites us and all that ensures that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you very much.